Chasm the Rift is a first-person shooter made by a small Ukrainian group called Action Forms. This was released in 1997, 1 year after the release of high-profile titles such as Quake and Duke Nukem 3D. Most people have never heard of this game. This plays out like any other first-person shooter of its time. You get weapons and ammo, lots of monsters to shoot at, and just enough of a storyline to give you a reason to shoot them. There wasn't much hype surrounding this game. Your enemies are the Time Strikers, aggressive mutants from the past, present, and future. In the game, you play as a specially trained commando who volunteered to investigate a recent attack by the Time Strikers. However, the objective is not to investigate them. That would be boring. Your objective is to travel through time and kill them. Fight them in the present, then travel to ancient Egypt, to the medieval times, and back. It does have one feature that makes it stand out from almost every game. You can shoot off an enemy's limbs. In itself, this is awesome. Take them apart piece by piece. It's a fun little feature to have, but this does have a strategic aspect to it as well. By using this method, you can disarm enemies. This is especially useful when going up against enemies with powerful weapons. Enemies with rocket launchers can bring your health down to almost nothing in one shot, so it's best to remove their offensive capabilities. The enemies themselves are unique to a certain extent. They're mutants and aliens in various time frames, from infantry and automated turrets to jesters, Vikings, and skeletons. There's also a boss fight at the end of every time frame, with the surrounding environment purpose-built for the engagement. The weapons that appear in the game feel uninspired, as if they were copied and pasted with a few tweaks. When you compare this to the weapons in other games around this time, the selection is pretty much stock. Weapons such as a rifle with infinite ammo, a standard shotgun, a couple automatics, a rocket launcher that looks like a grenade launcher, a laser crossbow, and something that resembles a BFG, ripped straight from Doom. Not too impressive, but they get the job done. On a lighter note, I would say the sound is fairly decent. The weapons sound powerful, and the monsters sound creepy and hostile. I have no complaints about the audio, except the voice acting. The dialogue seems a bit subpar, but I think it has more to do with the writing than the actual voices. Maybe it's just me, but the dialogue seems a bit too cheesy for my tastes. But the best sound in the game would have to be the CD music. It's an ambient soundtrack which adds to the overall atmosphere of the game. And of course, what would the atmosphere be without the graphics? At the time, hardware-accelerated graphics in video games was in its infancy. The 3DFX Voodoo chipsets were cutting-edge technology, but the video cards lacking OpenGL support were much more common. To that end, the game only supported software-rendered graphics, but it had some of the best software-rendered graphics of its time. The 3D models used in this game rivaled that of Quake, with more fluid animations and more overall detail. However, Chasm the Rift was not a true 3D game. Although all the monsters, items, and weapons used 3D models, the levels themselves were actually 2D with a height map, similar to games like Doom or games that used Ken Silverman's build engine. When looking up and down, you'll notice that the corners of the walls stay as a vertical straight line, and because of this limitation, it was not possible for the game to have a room above another room. Fortunately, limitations in game engines generally means lower hardware requirements. Considering the level structure and the decision to only support software rendering, this game was specifically designed to run on older hardware. It would have been a must-have game for a lot of people, but there were two major flaws that I believe prevented it from truly being a great game. First, there was the level design. It's too confusing. Since the levels are in fact 2D, it allows the game to generate an automap, but even then, it's frustrating to navigate through some of the levels because every corridor looks like every other corridor, and they're not even that wide. If you're fighting an enemy, it's hard, if not impossible, to sidestep to dodge their attacks. You have to constantly back up and hope you don't run out of space. It's easy to get cornered in many of these levels, and you can't even jump over them to escape. So forget about playing skillfully. You just have to sit there and take it until one of you is left standing. The monster placement doesn't help at all either. A lot of times, they're placed so close to a corner that when you turn that corner in the level, they're already in your face, smacking you around and dealing out the punishment, so you don't have any time to react. Even if you're ready for them, you can't avoid taking damage because there's just no space to maneuver. On a positive note, the locations at least look like what they're supposed to be. You got military bases, ancient Egyptian structures, and medieval towns and castles, all with a fair amount of detail despite the limitations in the engine. The second flaw is its lackluster multiplayer mode. Initially, it had 0, but after a lot of criticism surrounding its lack of multiplayer capabilities, the developers released a patch that allowed you to play on a network, and eventually another one to play online. Was it good enough? Not by a long shot. Small deathmatch levels, 0 consideration for weapon and item placement, and there's just too many dead ends that break the flow of the game. Mix it all together, and you got a horrible deathmatch experience. Again, this goes back to poor level design. The developers can make the levels look good, but the flow of these level arrangements make them horrible to play in. Like in many other games, you could also use the single-player levels for deathmatch by adding weapons and items exclusive to the game mode and removing certain walls to improve the flow of the gameplay. In Chasm the Rift, the single-player levels barely have any deathmatch capabilities, and they remain unchanged for the most part. There are weapons that only appear in deathmatch, but it seems like the weapons were placed at random. In some levels, such as the very first level in the game, there are no deathmatch items. The only weapon you can pick up is the shotgun. Not only is it not a very fun deathmatch level to only use 2 weapons, you would also have players camping those spots protecting that weapon. Even worse, some of the single-player levels are simply unplayable in deathmatch. Almost all of the doors that were locked in single-player are still locked. So you would have to go around, activate all the switches, and open all the doors before you can even consider playing. And what the hell is this? I spawned outside the boundaries of the map. This is not fun. You're stuck with 6 badly designed deathmatch levels. Long story short, multiplayer support is broken. It should have had a well thought out implementation or not be in the game at all. Imagine this, if you will. Fast-paced deathmatch action together with the limb removing mechanics. Blow your buddy's arm off, they lose their weapon. In this case, the developers were simply piggybacking off of the success of Doom and Quake's multiplayer modes. It's great that they listened to their fans, but I don't think they understood the formula for success. The game's demo included 3 levels modified from the full version to include some of the enemies from other time periods. This is how I first found out about this game back then, but this never really kept my interest for long. There were much better games on the market. By all means, it's definitely not a Quake killer like many small groups have tried to make in the late 90s, but it had all the requirements for a decent game. Shooting off an enemy's limbs was a definite plus in fun and tactics, and barely any games have this feature. The graphics and sound were decent for what they ran on, but the gameplay suffers due to poor level design. There's only 16 levels in the game, which is not much for a commercial release. Nonetheless, the game is fun to play, if only for a short time. Forget about multiplayer, but I'd say the single-player component is worth at least 1 playthrough. For a lot of games, there was always 1 or 2 major flaws that prevented them from becoming memorable classics. They could be things like level design, gameplay features, poor graphics, maybe something external such as a lack of exposure to the public. The games are good enough, but they're not as good as they could have been. They just don't have any lasting appeal, and they won't give you the urge to play it again months or years in the future. Chasm the Rift is one of those games. But if you haven't played it yet, check it out.